started. Aloha kako. My name is Brianna Gouveia. I'm the program specialist at the King Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center. Mahalo for joining our program this evening. I'd like to thank Chief Justice Mark Rechtenwald and the Hawai'i Judiciary and Legislature for their continued support of our mission. Joining us tonight are Lance Collins and Aina Iglesias, who in just a minute will learn from about how law and public policy have impacted the everyday lives of Filipinos in Hawaii. Lance is an attorney in private practice on Maui. Previously, he taught for the University of Hawaii at Manoa's Ilocano's Language and Literature program. Lance received a PhD in political science from UH Manoa, and his research focuses on the comparative legal history of Hawaii and the Philippines before and during their American colonial periods. Aina is a Waikiki hotel worker and a labor and youth organizer. She's also an ethnic studies graduate at UH Manoa. Aina was born in Pangasinan, Philippines, and moved here to Oahu when she was 9 years old. Mahalo nui, Aina and Lance, for sharing your mana'o tonight. Before we begin, I want to encourage our Zoom audience to send in questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll have time at the end to respond. A friendly reminder that this program is being recorded on our YouTube and will be posted to our YouTube as well later, and our public program section of our website. With that, Lance, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having us tonight. I want to sort of put a little disclaimer at the very beginning. Much of what I'm presenting is based on the research of other scholars. And if you're interested in a particular topic, I'm happy to provide additional reading and material upon request. I also would like to apologize for any errors or inaccuracies. Those are all of my own doing. I have a very short amount of time to cover a lot of information for some individuals who know nothing about the Philippines or Filipinos, and also for folks here who know everything about the Philippines and Filipinos. So I apologize for the incompleteness of the presentation and also for the tempo of my speaking. Okay. Oh, and now my share screen isn't working. Okay, there we go. The Philippines is a political grouping of 7,600 islands between Taiwan in the north and Borneo and Sulawesi in the south. 11 islands account for 95% of the surface area of the country, and the 50 largest islands have 96% of the population. The country is divided into 3 broad areas: Luzon in the north, Visayas in the center, and the Mindanao and southern islands in the south. There are 17 administrative regions, 81 provinces, and the national capital region of Manila. The Philippines also won an important convention, a Law of the Sea Convention decision in 2016 about what are small islands or rocks in the Permanent Court of Arbitration against the People's Republic of China. If you're interested in that, you should definitely take a read of the decisions that the court came up with. So for a long time, the first evidence of humans in the Philippines was Tabon Cave in Palawan 47,000 years ago. And then more recently, there's a discovery of evidence of humans in Caluyao Cave in Cagayan Valley 67,000 years ago. And then very recently in that same cave, in a deeper part of it, was evidence of hominids who had butchered some megafauna 710,000 years ago. And because Luzon for the last million or so years has not been connected to any other landmass, it means that the pre-human hominids that appeared at this deep layer of this cave had to have arrived by boat. Okay, there is a dispute in anthropology about the origins of the Philippine people. There are 2 camps, one associated with the late UH anthropology professor Bill Solheim, and the other associated today with UH linguistics professor Robert Blust. And I'm not going to get into that dispute today. I'm just going to focus on primarily Professor Blust's theory. In short, climactic changes and technological developments prompted a group of people to migrate from Southeast China to Taiwan about 7,000 years ago. Then approximately 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, some of these people sailed south and began to populate the coastal areas of the Philippines. There were already people in the Philippines, and some of these families mixed and some did not. However, all of the people in the Philippines today presently speak Austronesian languages. After several hundred years, groups of these people then moved in relatively quick fashion to Micronesia, south to Borneo, and eventually on to Madagascar, east to Maluku and the Papua Islands, And eventually some of these families migrated as far as the remote areas of Melanesia and eventually colonized all of Polynesia. The Austronesians were seafaring fisher farmers. They had a specific set of cultural practices regarding land practices, tattooing, sailing, housing, woodwork, kinship patterns, wetland agriculture, art motifs, etc. They also took with them dozens of plants that we call the canoe plants, such as banana, coconut, breadfruit, pandanus, kukui, yams, taro, and paper mulberry. And they also traveled with chickens, pigs, and dogs. There are over 1,200 Austronesian languages that are broken up into 7 branches. Only one of those branches exists outside of Taiwan, which is the Malayo-Polynesian branch. And in this map is all of the languages that fall under the blue, green, yellow, and purple circles. And just so that you get an idea, I'm going to give you the translation for 4 words in Ilocano, Tagalog, Samoan, and Hawaiian, just so you have an idea of what the cognates sound like. So the word for sky in Ilocano is langit. It's also langit in Tagalog. It's langi in Samoan and lani in Hawaiian. House in Ilocano is balay. In Tagalog, bahay. In Samoan, fale. And in Hawaiian, hale. Fire in Ilocano and Tagalog is apoy. In Samoan, it's afi. And in Hawaiian, it's ahi. And the number 5 in all of these languages is lima. Accent shifts depending on what the language is. Okay. The Philippines is home. The reason why I even talk so much about the languages is because the Philippines is home to 183 living languages. There are 14 major languages of 1 million or more speakers, and there are 40 minority languages that are expected to go extinct in the next 20 years. There's many languages now where the parents have not taught their children their language, and basically when the parents die, that will be the end of that language. Okay. This is a picture of the Laguna copper plate inscription. It's dated 900 CE. It is the earliest known calendar dated writing found in the Philippines. It's written in Old Malay, and the script is a Javanese script called Old Kawi. And it just has some extraneous legal writing on it. So because the Philippines is composed of many different peoples, this chart, which I found online, shows what in Tagalog is called baybayin, or in Ilocano, kuritan, which are writing syllabaries that were used historically, and then for the ones that say babayan today, are used by some small groups in Mindoro and Palawan. And these scripts show Indian cultural influence via Java and Borneo cultures. Okay, so in addition to the indigenous traditions of Austronesian and pre-Austronesian cultures, Filipino cultures have been strongly influenced by Indic, Sinic, and Java Sumatra Bornean cultures. This is a picture of Borobudur in Java, and it's supposed to represent in some way the Srivijaya and Majapahit empires, which brought Indic influences to the Philippines. So words in various Philippine languages from Indian sources include Datu, Raja, Diwata, Agham, Suka, Bagay, Gulay, Manga, and Marungay. Record of contact with China, which is these shards of ceramics, goes back to the Song dynasty, although it would be surprising if there weren't sustained interactions before then, and I'm sure there's a Chinese studies scholar here who can tell me I'm wrong. Just as there are many Japanese contacts later on. Halo Halo, for example, is something that was produced in the Philippines based on Japanese contact in the 19th and early 20th century. So some of the Hokkien words that are present in many Philippine languages, which I'm sure many people are familiar with, are things like pansit, bakya, bachoy, inchik, lumpia, and toyo. Okay, and then I have this picture. It's supposed to be like the Indonesian warrior and Indonesian movie I found. But anyways, yeah, so they represent Islamic influences in the Philippines, which is sort of the last of the different cultures that touched down. And there's only a few Arabic words that I could find in multiple Philippine languages. The general word for alcohol, alak or arak, is one of them, salamat being another. Anyways, the Tamil-based Chola Empire caused the collapse of the Srivijaya Empire, which was a Hindu-Buddhist empire. And after that, basically Islamic sultanates started popping up throughout island Southeast Asia, starting in Kedah, followed by the Samudera Darussalam in 1300, and eventually the Sultanate of Malacca in 1400. And around the end of this time, where what's now Indonesia and Malaysia became Islamicized, Sufi missionaries were sent to Jolo and Mindanao to become missionaries and spread Islam in what's now the Philippines. And so some of the well-known Islamic polities of the 16th century were the Sultanate or the Lakandam of Tondo, the Rajanate of Cebu, and the Rajanate of Manila. Okay, let's talk about the Spanish arriving, even though they weren't actually Spanish. So Magellan was a Portuguese captain who had been involved in establishing the Goa and Cochin colonies in India, and then the Portuguese conquest of Malacca. And after that, he proposed to sail to get to Malacca, going west to the Portuguese crown, and they rejected that. So he shopped his idea over to the Castilian and Aragonese crown, and because Portugal had a papal-based monopoly over trade sailing from Africa to Asia, the crown said yes. And well, in this picture, as you can see, it didn't end well for Magellan. Chief Lapu-Lapu, the Datu of Mactan, killed him in hand-to-hand combat in the shallow waters off of Mactan. Maybe, I don't know. I see this image in many different paintings, so I assume that somebody knew that it happened in shallow water. Maybe it happened on land. The remaining sailors who didn't die in this hand-to-hand combat ended up going back to Spain, and the islands became a major object for the future domination of the so-called Spanish. Okay, this is a painting by the Ilocano painter Juan Luna. He's from Badok. If you ever get to Badok, it's a lovely place. He has a lovely brick house, and they have a wonderful island that has a great surf spot. Okay, this is called the Blood Compact, and it's between a conquistador named Miguel Lopez de Legazpi and the chief Sikatuna of the island of Bohol. And they engaged in a political alliance using a blood compact, and Juan Luna, 19th century Ilocano painter, painted a massive painting of this. Anyways, Legazpi's time, which was later than Magellan's, was when the Spanish took control over major population centers in the Philippines, and much of it was completed by 1579. Okay, so the Castilian and Aragonese crown treated the islands much like they did the Spanish Crusades. They nominally incorporated territory and distributed control over those lands to warrior, elite, and religious orders. The Visigothic customs and privileges of the Spanish legal system prevailed, which means there was no unified legal system that we associate with modern nation states. Each fiefdom and religious order had overlapping and multiple legal systems. In the Philippines, regular Catholic orders divvied up the territories. Now, these people are not the people who did that in the 16th century, but I could only find comparable images of these different orders in modern times. So we have the Augustinians, the Franciscans, the Jesuits in the center, the Dominicans, and the Recollects, which are actually a form of Augustinians. And as conquistadors in there, some who did bring their families died or moved away, the religious orders amassed more and more property that was bequeathed to them. Okay, so food names entered the Philippine languages nominally via Spanish: avocado, achuete, cacao, camatis, camote, sayote, sincamas, tamales, changue, chicle, and chocolate. All of these words came from Nahuatl, which is a local Aztec language of Mexico. And I only mention all of this because most of the colonial elite and overlords who ruled in the Philippines, and there were very few of them throughout the Spanish period, were mostly Mexican or of other Latin American origin. There were very few people from Spain who actually ruled in the Philippines. Okay, so I have the slide here is the Galleon trade. Well, the Galleon trade was between Mexico and Acapulco, and I think Acapulco is spelled wrong there. Sorry, it's not my map. It went on from 1565 to 1815. 75% of the goods to Manila were from Mexico and were primarily Mexican and Bolivian silver. And the goods that came back were Chinese goods, and the majority of the galleon crews were Filipino, and the ships were eventually all built in the Philippines. The galleon trade made many individual priests and soldier administrators fabulously wealthy, and it also contributed to the finances of governing the Philippines. Okay. Felipe II was the German-Portuguese son of Charles V, who ruled Spain and many other European countries, and the islands were named after him. He was a Habsburg. His great-grandson, Carlos II, with the noticeable chin, was the last Habsburg monarch of Spain. And Felipe V was the first French monarch to rule Spain, and this happened in 1700. So Beside Felipe V's rule being marked by the War of Spanish Succession, the Bourbons formally ended all of the overlapping and conflicting legal systems in Spain and established a unified legal system based upon the authority of the king. Well, that was wildly unpopular with all of the local elites, not to mention the religious orders. And so he immediately granted most of these local elites and religious orders special privileges to be exempted in some way from this unified legal system. So in 1700, it really didn't mean anything. But I want to mark it because this is supposed to be about legal history. Okay, next slide. Oh, did that work? No. There we go. Okay, so in 1762, the British occupied Manila as part of the 7 Years' War, which was a war that was European-centered, but it was a global conflict, and it involved the Austrian succession, which is actually the other place the Habsburgs ruled. The occupation occurred for almost 2 years, and during this time, native Filipino elite who opposed Spanish governance rebelled, hoping the British occupation had weakened the Spanish to allow for independent rule. And so the most famous revolt that ended in the execution of Gabriela Silong was based in Vigan, and she was a half Ilocana, half Tinggian from Abra. Mother was from Abra, and she had married a guy named Diego Silong, and they tried to basically capture Vigan, and that didn't work, and eventually the Spanish executed her. But she is a national symbol of the feminine struggle against colonialism, so I thought I would include that in the slide. Okay, 1788. The Ka'iana, who's the famous or infamous chief of Hawaiʻi, went on a voyage to Asia. And on his return from visiting Hong Kong and other places, the ship stopped in Zamboanga. And he enjoys the honor of being the first known Hawaiian chief to visit what is now known as the Philippines. So that has really nothing to do with anything, but I thought I'd slip it in. Okay. In the 1770s, the cost of administering the Philippines required officials to find new sources of revenue beyond the galleon trade, which was increasingly losing money on a formal sense, although the people who were involved in it were still being fabulously wealthy. So the Spanish did this by establishing what's called the tobacco monopoly. Farmers in all of the Ilocano provinces and also on the island of Marinduque were required to plant Virginia tobacco, and only Virginia tobacco. They were only allowed to sell it to the government, and the price was fixed by the government. So this entirely disconnected whole populations of subsistence farmers from farming and turned them into a proto-form of wage laborers without true industrialization. So the population, especially in Ilocos, increased significantly. And by the time the tobacco monopoly ended, there were a lot of people and not enough land to farm for subsistence purposes. Okay. In 1821, Mexico won its independence, and Spain, which retained the Philippines in that process, began to govern the Philippines, the Carolinas, and the Marianas as the Spanish East Indies, directly from Madrid. Mexican independence ended the galleon trade, and colonial administrations were desperate for new business ventures for themselves and also revenue for the government. So in the 19th century, the first guy, Governor Pascal, pushed through a series of economic reforms that fostered free trade in the Philippines and basically turned the Philippines oriented it towards global trade in 1834. He also did a bunch of other things like tried to build roads and bridges and so forth, but basically with the intention of allowing trade to happen at a quicker pace. Now, the guy on the right, I put him in because many Filipinos have last names that are Spanish. But are they Spanish? And I say probably not. And the reason why is because Claveria required all Filipinos to take last names in 1849 if they didn't have one. And actually some people who had last names had to change their last names because everybody couldn't be De La Cruz. So they were required to pick a last name from a book compiled by Spanish officials. And every town could only pick certain names off of certain pages of this book. So everybody has a last name. A lot of them are Spanish, but that doesn't mean that they have a Spanish ancestor. It means in 1849 they picked or were assigned a Spanish last name. So anyways, I think what's important about 19th century Spanish colonialism is now there really is a Spanish government, and they really are making major and radical reorganization and changes in the Philippine economy and society towards global export of agricultural products. And this totally changed how the Spanish interacted with what are now Filipinos. And it also increased the amount of native upper class and also allowed a larger native upper class to be more wealthy. Okay, so I'm going to skip over a whole bunch of end of 19th century history and try to encapsulate it into a mini biography of these four people. we'll see how I do that. Okay, the first is Jose Rizal, probably the most famous Filipino writer in the world. He was also a doctor. He formed a group called La Liga that pushed for reforms of Spanish rule in the Philippines. He did not advocate independence. And for his efforts, he was executed by the Spanish authorities. Well, that triggered the next guy, Andres Bonifacio, to found what is originally the secret organization called Ka Taas Taasan, Ka Galang Galangan, Ka Tipunan ng Mga Anak ng Bayan, known concisely as Katipunan. And this was a revolutionary organization that led the struggle for independence from Spain, and they were wildly successful. Now, the next guy was another Katipunan figure, and he eventually executed Bonifacio. He organized the first republic of the Philippines called the Malolos Republic, and he served as the Philippines' first president. Now, history has not been kind to him, even though he was the Philippines' so-called George Washington. And that was primarily because American colonial officials pushed devotion to Rizal as the nonviolent reformer and tried to minimize and tarnish Aguinaldo, who had been a general and a revolutionary. And so while he lived until the 1960s, he remains an ambiguous and tarnished figure in a Philippine history. And finally, I also picked Mabini, not because my mother comes from Batangas and he's from Batangas and I'm being provincial, but he was the brains behind the Malolos Constitution. He was a revolutionary, and he was also the first prime minister of the Philippine Republic. He refused to take an oath to the Americans when the Philippine-American War ended, and that caused him to be exiled to Guam, where poor conditions led to deteriorating health. And just before he died, they allowed him to come back so that he could die in the Philippines. And I want to note that he was paralyzed due to polio, and he led his entire revolutionary life from the seat of a chair. Okay. The Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War, also known, what I like to call the American War for Cuba, resulted in the US obtaining all of Spain's colonial possessions outside of Africa, except for Cuba. Spanish claims to the Philippines were purchased for $20 million. And of course, like any land deed, you only get what the person who's giving the deed to you has. And so instead of getting the Philippines, the US got the Malolos Republic and then commenced what was ultimately over a 10-year battle of control over the Philippines. And although the US government had its mission accomplished moment in 1902, the fighting continued until 1911. And unlike the Spanish governance, the Americans used military force to obtain control of all land and all people in the Philippines. So the Spanish did not do that. The Spanish controlled population centers, they created population centers, they had some kind of nominal control the farther you got away from these centers. The Americans did not do that. They did universal coverage of control. Okay. Now, the Americans wanted the Philippines because of its natural resources, timber and minerals, and agricultural products, sugar and coconut for the oil. The transition to American domination occurred under the banner of rule of law. And so many colonial officials were trained as lawyers and had been jurists. Taft, for example, the first governor, went on to become the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And the last governor, Frank Murphy, became an Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court after. Most Filipinos before the Americans had no connection or access to any formal legal system. Disputes were resolved by traditional authority within the family or the clan or by the parish priest. The last part of the 19th century was the Spanish attempting to introduce a formal unified legal system, but widely resisted by religious authorities, and it was a system that was only accessible to the upper classes. The Americans created a universal American-style legal system as though they were organizing a new state. They readopted a few of the Spanish laws that had been introduced at the very end of Spanish rule, and they required their Supreme Court to issue opinions for the first 5 years in Spanish. But thereafter, the Philippines had a universal legal system in the Anglo-American common law tradition, even though a lot of people claim it's a mixed tradition. There's nothing Spanish about the American legal system that the Americans introduced when they took over the Philippines. So the Republicans who were organizing the government attempted to pursue a whole wide variety of progressive public administration concepts like merit-based civil service. However, in order to win the democratic elections that they were also required to conduct, Taft and others resorted to Tammany Hall-style politics, and thus began the great American political tradition of machine politics in the Philippines. Okay, I think I'm talking too slow. Okay, I'm just gonna cut this down. So Philippine voters did not vote for US president. They did not vote for their own governor who was appointed by the US president, and they did not vote for any of the positions that were appointed by the US governor or the president or the governor. But they constituted 10% of the US population in 1903. So it's just good to understand that American colonial officials basically had the duty to hide the Philippines as not being part of the United States, even though it legally was. American colonial officials hid major political and social changes they undertook under a narrative that they were just completing what the Spanish had attempted and failed to do so because of Spanish defects, which was namely to civilize Filipinos. Okay. Jose Libornio. Professor Jose Libornio was a member of the Royal Hawaiian Band during the Kingdom period. And when the American military violently overthrew the Hawaiian Kingdom, he, along with his bandmates, refused to work for the provisional government and take an oath of allegiance. A song known as Mele Ai Pohaku was written by Ellen Prendergast to celebrate the refusal. I think most of us know this song today as Kalana Napua. Jose Libornio, one of the members of the band, was the person who actually composed the melody for that song. Professor Libornio traveled to the US to get support for the restoration of the monarchy, and when that failed, he and his second wife moved to Peru. Okay. The Insular Cases. The Insular Cases were a series of tax and citizenship cases that arose from challenges to US government actions in and related to the new territories that the US had acquired. Many related to Puerto Rico, and the central question was whether the Constitution follows the flag. These cases created a distinction between unincorporated and incorporated territories, and the Supreme Court ruled repeatedly that Congress had the power to decide when the Constitution applied to a non-state territory in the possession of the United States. For Hawaii, our seminal insular case is Hawaii versus Mankichi, and in the Philippines, it was Dorr versus United States, and there were actually a whole bunch of others after that in the Philippines, but those were sort of the seminal cases. And in 2004, the US Supreme Court actually re-examined the doctrine that underlied the insular cases in 3 cases related to the holding of individuals without charge at Guantanamo Bay. Russell v. Bush, Hamdan v. Rumsfeld, and Boumediene versus Bush. So if you're interested in that, feel free to look at those cases. Okay, so Philippine labor was looked at by the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association after Hawaii was incorporated into the United States, partly due to the rise in anti-Japanese sentiment, particularly after Japan defeated Russia in 1905. It should also be noted that the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association actually used racial difference as a money-saving tool in labor management. Okay, I'll talk about that a little bit. So from 1906 to 1934, tens of thousands of Filipinos migrated to Hawaii, almost all of to work on the sugar or pineapple plantations. And until 1920, most of the workers came from the Western Visayas, although others did come from Ilocos and the Manila area. There was a need for Tagalog, and there was a need within the Tagalog and Visayan regions for labor for sugar and other industrial export agricultural activities. And so after 1920, Ilocos became the primary site of labor recruitment because they still had a significant surplus in population and also did not have a burgeoning industrial sugar or other major export agricultural activity. So Ilocanos were drawn to Hawaii because of the so-called Kasla Gloria stories or the Paraiso stories that Hawaii is a paradise. And the HSPA strongly sought out laborers who could not read or write specifically. Okay, during the territorial period, I'm just going to skip over most of this. These are the citations if you want to look up any of these cases. But the long story short was US immigration law only allowed free white persons to enter the United States. And the decision was that Japanese, Chinese, Hawaiians, and American Indians were not free white persons and could not become citizens of the United States. And that was in 1922. It was confirmed by the US Supreme Court in Ozawa versus the United States. And Filipinos were US nationals. They were not citizens of the United States. And so shortly after that, the Attorney General at the time, John Matthewman, ruled that Filipinos were therefore aliens ineligible for civil service jobs, and the territory fired the one Filipina public school teacher who worked at that time. Okay. 1920, this is Mr. and Mrs. Florencio Lorioso. They were married in the Honolulu District Court at the beginning of July, and a neighbor called the police claiming that something was suspicious, and it was discovered that Mrs. Lorioso, formerly Benita Ocho, was actually born Benito Ocho, a man. And no charges were filed, but Mrs. Lorioso was forced to wear men's clothes, and the police cut her very long hair. Okay. Pablo Manlapit. Pablo Manlapit was the first Filipino lawyer admitted to practice in Hawaii. He was a labor organizer. He participated in the 1920 strike, and that prompted the territory of Hawaii to seek his disbarment, which failed as a reported case 25 Hawaii 547. He later was convicted of labor organizing related charges based on another strike, and eventually was exiled from Hawaii. He returned and was involved in the 1937 Pu'unene strike, which got a bunch of benefits for the workers, but eventually he returned to the Philippines and he died there. There were a number of Filipino labor organizations starting in the late teens that sought to organize for better wages and living conditions. Manlapit's Filipino Federation of Labor, there was the higher wages movement, among others. And at one point, the territory of the Philippines sent a commissioner, Cayetano Ligot, as a representative to assist workers, but basically all he did was side with the HSPA, and so Filipinos hated him. At least that's what it says in all the newspapers. So I think what's important to understand is that the plantation used racial and ethnic difference to divide workers. There were pay differentials based on race as well as other benefits, with Caucasian managers at the top and Filipinos at the bottom. Within the Filipino community, the educated and professionals were at the top, and the majority, who are the cicadas, were at the bottom. This is from Milton Murayama's All I Asking For Is My Body. Okay, the Great Depression ushered in massive unemployment. In response, the US Congress passed the Tidings-McDuffie Act, which created a path for independence for the Philippines and redesignated Filipinos as aliens. They also passed the Filipino Repatriation Act to pay Filipinos to go back to the Philippines. And of course, very few people took them up, and the act was considered a failure. The anti-Filipino sentiment was palpable. In 1930, Filipinos made up 70% of the plantation workforce, but by the end of World War II, they made up only 19%. Okay, what's going on? Okay. A third of all Ilocano cicadas returned to Ilocos after working the plantations, and about a sixth of them moved to the continent to pursue work there in the fisheries and as migrant agricultural laborers. But half of them remained in Hawaii. And Filipinos set up lives, and the gender ratio was well out of balance, and many Filipino workers who remained married women of other ethnicities, including Hawaiian women. Many workers who returned to Ilocos after working the plantations used money saved to buy rice fields and returned to Ilocos very wealthy. They would marry a young woman as wife and have a big family. And in this way, Ilocano workers altered Ilocano society, but did not radically transform it. Ilocano literature, by the way, and I chose Banawag here to be the picture, was mostly a religious literature in nature in the 19th century, but rapidly expanded with money from Hawaii plantation workers seeking materials in the Ilocano language. And there's a huge secular Ilocano literature that flourished in the 1930s, including also Banawag here. The first movie in Ilocano was called Karayao in 1940, and there was another film in Ilocano in the 60s called Hawaiiano. And both featured stories about the struggles of plantation workers, and of course had a love element to it. Okay, I'm gonna run out of time. There was, in World War II, the first Filipino infantry regiment, and in 1943, after the Hawaii Sugar Planters Association withdrew its objections to taking laborers out of the plantations, Hawaii Filipinos were allowed to join, and C.J. Richardson, Chief Justice Richardson, was an officer in that regiment. So I'm just going to insert here, because I don't have a slide for it because there's no pictures of him, that the last person executed by the territory of Hawaii was in 1944, and his name was Adriano Domingo. And although it took 13 years for the legislature to abolish capital punishment, he was the last one. And the reason why they abolished capital punishment in Hawaii was because predominantly the people being executed were poor working class Hawaiians and Filipinos, and of course Japanese. There was a racial and a class element to who was being executed. It wasn't fair. And so Adriano Domingo, unfortunately, has the distinction of being the last person executed in the territory of Hawaii, a young Filipino boy from Kauai, very young man. Okay, also, before I go to the next slide, the McCarran-Walters Act of 1952 liberalized immigration laws and allowed aliens ineligible for citizenship to become citizens. And so usually it's talked about how a lot of Issei Japanese were allowed to become citizens, but also older Filipinos were also became eligible for citizenship because of that. Okay, 1950s bar passing Filipino attorneys. So they all actually graduated from law school at about the same time, but like Bernie Bikoy went off to Korea, and people did different things. So Anyways, there's Epi Adao, Alfred Loretta, Ben Minor, Peter Aduha, and Bernie Bicoy. I'm going to toggle to the next one because I'm just going to do this very quickly because I'm going to run out of time. Then we also have Tata Pablo Caldito, George Pascua, Pedro de la Cruz, and Joe Yadao. Okay, so let me tell their story. So Peter Aduha was the first elected Filipino in the United States. He eventually became a district court judge. And then that was in 54, 56, Pablo Caldito was elected to the Maui Board of Supervisors. 58, Pedro de la Cruz was elected to the House from Lanai. He was an ILWU organizer on Lanai. In 59, Alfred Loretta was appointed by Governor Quinn to the Honolulu Liquor Commission after Quinn's previous nominee, Harry Cronick, said Filipinos are more dangerous than others when drinking. I don't even know why I'm telling that. Okay, 1959, Epi Adao was appointed to the Big Island Board of Supervisors, and he was subsequently elected until he suddenly died. Ben Minor was the first Phil-Am appointed as a district court magistrate. In 1960, George Pascua was elected to the Kauai Board of Supervisors. In 62, Ben Minor was elected to the Senate, and Rudy Picaro, who's in another slide, was elected to the House. And then in 1966, Joe Yadao was the first Filipino elected to office in Hawaii, and I think also the first Filipino elected to public office in the United States, but is never honored as such. 1974, Ben Minor was elevated to the Hawaii Supreme Court, and in 78, Judge Loretta was appointed the first Filipino-American U.S. federal district court judge. Okay. So in 65, there were some major changes to immigration laws. It was a huge shift. American immigration policy greatly reduced the race, ethnic limitations put on immigration to the United States and focused, with some limitations, on family-based and employment-based immigration. And so I've just listed the preferences, how people are allowed to be petitioned to come to the United States. And then I picked I think this is the August Department of State's bulletin for visas. So if I petitioned a brother or a sister in the Philippines today, it basically would take them 20 years before their petition was even checked by the US government. So that just gives you an idea of people who, other than marriage, people who are petitioned as a family, it takes many, many years. Philippines, Mexico, China, India have these backlogs because every country has a limit, and then any country that doesn't use their limit, it just is a first come, first serve. And so there are still racial, ethnic limitations on immigration into the United States, but this greatly liberalized it. And so a lot of Filipinos came, both for employment-based and also for family-based. Okay, a couple of more Filipinos in politics, because if I don't mention all these people, someone's going to have their feelings hurt. So Rudy Picaro was the council chair for after he was in the House. Eddie Malapit, or Mala, was the mayor of Kauai, the first Filipino mayor. Cano was the first Filipino governor in the US. And then, of course, Lorraine Inouye was mayor of the Big Island from 1990 to 1992. Okay. I'm just going to run through these very quickly so that I don't take up all the time. Okay, so these are Hawaii's three Filipino ancestry Supreme Court justices: Justice Ben Minor, Justice Mario Ramil, and Justice Simeon Akoba Jr. Okay, discrimination in education. Hawaii's school system long suffered historical patterns of de facto segregation as a reflection of plantation and territorial use of racial differences as a form of controlling labor. The extensive use of private schools by class and race was present, and there were English standard schools and eventually tracking. Title VI of the Civil Rights Act required governments to ensure government services did not use limited English proficiency as a proxy for national origin discrimination. And the state DOE resisted compliance with Title VI for that purpose and actually refused to keep statistics on language minorities and ethnicities. And Congresswoman Patsy Mink actually really strongly pressured DOE to use funds from the Emergency School Aid Act of 1972 to try to minimize this problem. And they actually declined to do it at first, but eventually did agree to take some money. And then in 1974, Lau v. Nichols, US Supreme Court ruled that the public school systems were required under Title VI to assist children of limited English proficiency. And these are some of the well-known professors and Amy Agbayani's administrator, PhD, a Filipino ancestry at the University of Hawaii: Lindy Aquino, Rick Tremilios, Virgie Chatterjee, Tess Ramos, Amy Agbayani, and Leonard Andaya. Leonard Andia is, of course, from Maui. Okay, last slides. So, Mangraban v. UN complaint. In the late 1970s, Filipinos sued the Department of Health over a lack of language access in public health services. The state court case was dismissed because the state judge said that his parents had been of Japanese descent and were able to take care of themselves without needing translators, so the immigrants in the 1970s of the day could do the same. So the case was refiled in federal court, and the state eventually agreed to a stipulated judgment where they would hire 10 bilingual health aides until a court-appointed committee could come up with binding factual findings and recommendations. And the DOH rejected all of the recommendations that this committee made, but federal judge Sam King adopted the recommendations and ordered compliance. And so these are actually some ads that were taken out that were in the Honolulu Advertiser related to the Mangraban complaint, and they were in a bunch of different languages. Okay, so this is the language access laws, started as bilingual health education laws, and now all state agencies and any county agencies that receive state money are required actually to provide language access, both translations and interpretation under different circumstances. Okay, discrimination in professional licensing. So in a series of court cases, limitations on the privilege to practice law based on residency and alienage were struck down. And to comply with In re Griffiths, the Hawaii legislature passed Act 76, which removed the statutory requirement of citizenship to practice law. On the same day, the Hawaii Supreme Court amended its rules to allow immigrant attorneys to sit for the bar exam. This is a picture of Tony Ramil. He's an attorney on Maui. He had gone to the University of the Philippines Law School and had practiced as a lawyer before immigrating to the US. He was barred by that law from sitting for the bar exam. And so he worked for a Maui law firm as a clerk, and then he eventually decided to go to Richardson Law School when it opened up. And after 2 years of going to law school, the rules were changed, and so he sat for the bar exam, and he was basically in that first group of immigrant attorneys who became Hawaii licensed. And Ramil noted at the time that his law school had been started by American lawyers, taught an American law curriculum, and that the practice of law in the Philippines wasn't any different than the US. And so then he said, a little bit later, there's a feeling that there's no other purpose to some of Hawaii's strict professional requirements than to keep people out. And I think a lot of teachers from the Philippines probably feel the same way. Okay, last law case, second to last slide for me. So national origin discrimination in employment. This is Manuel Fragante. He was born in 1921. He was a well-educated retired military officer from the Philippines. He immigrated to Hawaii in 1981 and became a citizen in 83. He sat for the Honolulu City Civil Service test, and he ranked 1 of 371 people who took the test. And he applied to be a clerk at the DMV. And after an oral interview, the examiners wrote, quote, "Retired Philippine Army officer speaks with very pronounced accent, which is difficult to understand. He has 37 years of experience in management and administration and appears more qualified for professional rather than clerical work. However, because of his accent, I would not recommend him for this position." So Fragante sued, and the visiting federal district court judge found, quote, "While plaintiff has extensive verbal communication skill in English, it is understandable why the interviewers might reach their conclusions," end quote. And he denied the claim of national origin discrimination, which was subsequently affirmed by the Ninth Circuit. Now, the lawsuits did not work out well for Manuel Fragante, but it should be noted that while this litigation was going on, he did get hired and he did work for the unemployment division of the State Department of Labor, and he interacted with employers dealing with problems that they had with their reports for years with no problems. So it's just a note that sometimes even the law can't get it right. So this was in the 80s, and by the 80s, the labor needs of Hawaii were no longer the plantations, but instead was the service economy of tourism. And so with that, I will turn it over now to Aina, and I'm very sorry I went over my allotted time. Let's see, how do I stop sharing my screen? Okay.
Okay, I'm sorry, I was talking and didn't mute myself. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aina. If you have missed the intro, just a little bit about myself. Again, I'm a 1.5 generation Filipina. I was born in Pangasinan, moved to Hawaii in 2005. I graduated at UH Manoa with my bachelor's in ethnic studies, and I'm now a hotel worker. I work at Alana Doubletree in Waikiki as a front desk agent. So let me share screen. Alrighty. Okay, so a lot of my research was in high school and college was actually centered around Filipino workers in Hawaii. So thank you, Lance, for doing most of that. And today I'll be talking about labor and education. So Filipinos in Hawaii are largely working class. And although I recognize that all Filipinos dominate, Filipinos dominate the healthcare industry and other industries, I wanted to focus more on Filipinos working in service industry. Tourism is Hawaii's #1 revenue-making economy, and it's also our largest industry here in Hawaii. We also see a lot of Filipinos relying on these types of jobs today. So this is why I specifically wanted to focus on this. I don't mean to not be inclusive of other workers, but this is my expertise, so I'll talk about it. So 60 to 65% of Filipinos make up the tourism industry workforce, and Local 5 doesn't have the percentage of the percentage of women exactly, but the 60 to 65%, majority of them are women, most of them being in the housekeeping department. And although Filipinos are the backbone of our #1 revenue-making industry, they are the least paid workers. And housekeepers, which are worked by Filipino women, make about $25.28 an hour in union properties, compared to departments like front desk and engineering, where they make closer to $30 an hour. And that's why I say and I claim that Filipinos make the least, because they typically work in these departments. And out of all the departments in the hotels, they're the least paid, even with valet and food and beverage, which rely most of their income in tips. Housekeepers still make way less. And $25.28 might seem a lot, but that's only for union workers. In non-union workers, it's actually $15 an hour. Non-union workers typically make $10 less. So let's see. And according to Raise Up Hawaii, the bare minimum household survival budget in Hawaii is $80,381. That's the minimum. To live comfortably is $122,000. And I don't know how many of you are making $122,000 within your household, but me and my partner definitely don't make that much, even though we both work union jobs. And this has become like a normal thing for Filipinos to work multiple jobs, because again, Hawaii has a high cost of living, and our minimum wage today is still at $10.10. And the rent and again the cost of living just keeps going up and up. And so I picked this picture because one of Local 5, which is the Hotel Workers Union campaign, is "One job should be enough." They used the slogan for when they went on strike, the 51-day strike with the Marriott hotels, and even when we fought for our contracts in non-union hotels. So labor resistance, a lot of Filipino women actually dominate labor organizing. If you, looking at Local 5, when we unionized my hotel as an example, 5 out of 9 leaders, including myself, are Filipinos, and 4 of those 5 are women. And this is in a hotel that's like has workers of about 100 people. And this is really common in a lot of organized union hotels. You always see Filipino women become rank and file workers, taking hold in union office. You see them representing union grievances, and you even see them defending against management. The #1 tourism industry's union, Local 5, their president is also a Filipina immigrant, and her name is Gemma Weinstein. And she's a super strong person who has demonstrated her leadership in non-union organizing at airports and hotels. For the airports, she helped organize the food service workers in Honolulu, Maui, and Kauai. And she also helped mobilize and lead the 51-day strike with the Marriott workers that happened in 2018. It is just so amazing to see that a Filipino woman to be a president and to be a leader of the labor movement today in Hawaii. There are also other organizations that are led by Filipino and Filipino youth. Anak Bayan is a youth group that I'm a part of. Even though it just started the beginning of this year, they have already demonstrated their power by involving over 25 Filipino activists and allies. The group's main objectives include bridging resistance from Hawaii to the Philippines against the Duterte regime. And then another big one that they're doing, especially in the mainland, is organizing Filipino workers. And they've also already partnered up with Hawaii Workers Center, Local 5, and other organizations. Hawaii Workers Center, they've also been helping a lot of workers, especially those who have no access to a computer or don't know how to get through unemployment, especially during this time in COVID. They've been trying to help them go through that. Especially a lot of our workers, like Filipino workers, are unemployed at this time. Okay, so now moving on to education. So there, like Lance had mentioned earlier, there is apparent race discrimination in schools, even in universities in Hawaii. According to Dr. John Okumura, who's an ethnic studies professor at UH, said that the state is always short $278 million per year to provide adequate education for students. This underfunding results in a large number of students per classroom because there aren't really enough teachers. They've cut programs for STEM, arts, and sports, and etc. And now we look at this chart. This chart is from SEED, which they got from Hawaii. Which they got from DOE. But in here, we look at how 22.2% of students are in DOE are Filipino, but only 10.6% of them enroll as undergrads at UH Manoa. We also see that there's only 2.6% of faculty are Filipinos, and less than 8% of executives and admins are Native Hawaiians and Filipinos combined. That one, they didn't have like the specific number of Filipinos, but they just combined both. If you compare that to the white group, 16.6% make up DOE students. About 20.7% of them go enroll as undergrads at UH Manoa. And then for UH Manoa faculty, there's 53.1%, so they're overrepresented. And I believe also, I think 70%, I'll find the link later, but 70% of them are white men as working as faculty. So yeah, we just see how, you know, for a lot of students attending and even for people who are looking at it, it is very discouraging. And you can also see that we don't have that much representation in higher education. Another thing that I wanted to talk about as a challenge is the tuition increase every year at UH Manoa specifically, but also on other campuses. The reason I showed this table specifically, because this is the 5 years we see over 100% increase in tuition at UH Manoa. When I was doing my research, this is like the highest increase I've seen, and it's kind of crazy to me. I kind of wish I attended UH in 2006. But here we look at, for per semester, for full-time students, they pay $2,160. And then 5 years later, they're paying double that amount at $4,200. And same thing for, you know, for UH Shilo, West Oahu, and other community colleges, the tuition increased by a lot. And then even today, even though UH claimed to have frozen, you know, the tuition or have tuition freeze, it's still a lot of money. And over here, we see that per semester, a student in-state has to pay $5,652 per semester. And even though it's not gonna change for the next 3 years, for now. It is very discouraging for a lot of local people, especially for Filipino students, to go and to pursue higher education, even with the help of FAFSA or financial aid. That is, you still come out with thousands of dollars in loans. So, you know, a lot of my classmates and a lot of my friends have actually like every time I ask why they don't pursue higher education, it is because of tuition always comes up first. So UH has made it very difficult for local people, especially for Filipino and low income families, to pursue or to have access to higher ed. But there are stuff being done. So SEED, which stands for Student Equity, Excellence, and Diversity, they have over 20 programs to help underrepresented students, but specifically Gear Up. So Gear Up stands for Gaining Early Awareness and Readiness for Undergraduate Programs. It was created to help students that are in high school. Let's see. They're able to get funding to have Gear Up mentors working in Waihiwa, Waipahu, and Hilo, and other schools also. These communities are typically in low-income neighborhoods to help students see a pathway to higher ed. From fall 2013 to 2014, there was a 60% increase in enrollment from Nanakuli High School and 114 increase in enrollment from Waianae High School, where we also see a lot of, where there also is some Filipino students in there. And then, let's see. Honolulu Community College had partnered up with Gear Up also, and they created a peer mentorship program that supported a total of 117 students from Farrington and McKinley to complete college applications. And for many students, the transition from high school to college can be difficult, but in 2014 to 2015, Gear Up Hawaii worked with 9 UH campuses to provide over 2,262 students with transition support services. And I know Ms. Pruso is here. She was my high school teacher, but I was talking to her about HSTA, like if HSTA is doing something, but HSTA has a Human and Civil Rights Committee, and they've recently come up with an organization called CARES. It was a response to Black Lives Matter. And they said the purpose is to integrate social justice principles into education and create schools and communities that are safe for students. But there isn't really a lot of information online though, because it is so new and it happened during this COVID. What I do hope to see is that they have some sort of program to, and I'm sure that's what they're looking into it too, according to Ms. Russo, is to help students, especially from like Waipahu and Farrington, who want to pursue higher education and also who want to go into teaching. All right. Again, this is just some organizations. Don't get hurt if there are some organizations aren't mentioned, but there is a lot that's doing stuff around helping Filipinos pursue higher ed. And then last thing to close it, is something very related to today. I wanted to talk about Filipino communities during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a chart or a table that I got from the Department of Health. And we can see how 16%, okay, first I wanted to mention that for Native Hawaiians, that is if they listed Native Hawaiian as one of their races. So someone who is a Filipino and Native Hawaiian mixed race, they could also fall under Native Hawaiian. So there is an even Pacific Islander. So they're actually in those two. It's kind of confusing, but the way they've taken data is just overall confusing. But wanted to mention that 16% of state or 16% of state population are Filipinos, and 18% make up these cases, not including again these two. And that's 670 as of last week, and 12 total deaths. And we have the largest number of deaths in Hawaii. And I think that's because a lot of us are frontliners. We work in service industry. We work as healthcare workers. And a lot of things that are coming out in the news also is when one Filipino worker gets COVID, they come home to a family, typically in a multi-generational home, and then everyone else gets infected. So that's why the number is also very large. And then another thing on the labor side, a lot of companies are doing permanent layoffs. I just found out that Hawaiian Airlines are doing a lot of them also. But for a lot of hotels are doing a lot too. But specifically in the hotels I worked at, which are Hilton Waikiki Beach Hotel and Courtyard by Marriott Waikiki Beach Hotel, they've just recently fired all their workers and plan to rehire them once they reopen, hiring them through a third party, and which means that they're going to make much less. I don't know what kind of medical they're going to have. I don't know if they're going to have holiday pay. And, you know, because these workers are non-union and they don't have what we call recall rights. So recall rights pretty much means that if you are union and the company, the owner changes or something happens, you get laid off. When you get rehired, everything is in place. You get to keep your seniority, your pay, the contract stays the same, et cetera, et cetera. But because a lot of workers, around more than 50% of workers in Waikiki are not union, a lot of them have just been permanently laid off, which means they've also lost medical coverage. Especially during this time, I mean, it's really ironic that corporations and hotel employers are doing that, because in this time when we need it most, they should not be getting rid of medical coverage for workers. But even union hotels like mine, our medical or healthcare will only cover until the end of the month, and then we transition into what they call COBRA, which is gonna cost about $3,500 per worker, and that's something that workers have to pay out of pocket to pay for their medical. Every week, union and non-union workers have been meeting. They've built a safety committee to make sure that when we go back to the hotels and when they reopen tourism, that the hotels will be operating safely for the workers. So we are coming up with, we're negotiating things like, you know, having enough N95 masks for housekeepers for every room that they clean, or having enough hand sanitizers, stations in the hotel, within the hotel, and even making sure that the front desk has a plexiglass covered fully to make sure that when the guests come in, they don't get infected. So that's something that is still in the process, and we're coming up with a list of things to negotiate with hotels when we reopen tourism back for everyone. All right. So that is it. I know we went over time and there's a lot of Q&A.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Aina. You're still sharing your screen. You can keep up your PowerPoint if you like, or you can end your share screen. Excuse me. So let's see. Yeah, we have a lot of questions. Okay, I think I'll try to go back to Lance. Which of the three ethnic groups of Filipinos did most labor workers come from in the 19th century?
In the 20th century, I think most of the Filipinos that came to Hawaii in the 19th century generally were people who came from the Manila area, but there were very few of them. But of the plantation workers, definitely after 1920, were mostly from Ilocos. And I think a lot of people of Visayan heritage before 1920, a lot of them integrated into other ethnic groups and stuff. So there's I know a lot of Hawaiians who have a Filipino last name because they have like a grandfather who was Filipino. But yeah, from 1920 is basically Ilocano. And most of the Filipinos in Hawaii until around maybe the last 30 years were for sure everybody was Ilocano, and it's kind of changed with the immigration patterns now. But yeah, Ilocos.
Thank you. Here's a question for you, Aina and Lance as well. From DOE stats, 22% of Filipinos enrolled. and about half of that number pursues tertiary education. I'm not sure if they're speaking about. Anyway, do you think it is because Filipinos usually live in multi-generational households, thus the expectation is to get a job as soon as one is able to, rather than pursuing higher education?
That is one thing, yeah. Like a lot of them tend to just, and I don't want to speak for everyone, but that is very common, like especially for my relatives and my friends who live in in Filipino communities. They're expected to have a job and help with like paying rent and stuff like that right away. So they don't go the higher education route. They go through getting a job right away route to help with family paying bills and stuff like that.
If I could just add, that is something that does happen in a lot of multi-generational Filipino immigrant families. But I think what also needs to be put into context is, why is it that these 17 and 18-year-olds need to get jobs immediately after high school? And that's because they have to. People have to be able to eat, and the way that the family unit typically works is that that income is really needed. So, to be able to make that sacrifice, there are a lot of internal to the family hurdles, and then also there are a lot of institutional hurdles as well. And so if you make it too complicated to go to college, if you're sort of in that threshold where you could potentially do it, you end up not going because it ends up being too difficult, because it costs too much, or the lost income, or it's just there's a bunch of bureaucratic nonsense that sometimes can overwhelm people. So I think that is something that is experienced, but it's also there are reasons for it, that it's not, but Filipinos don't like education. It's like Filipinos love education, but if you have no money and you can't eat, then it's like not as the value of it, which is more long term, is something that seems more remote and unnecessary.
Maybe to just reflect on your guys' presentation as a whole, you really hit on the topics of labor, employment, income, and education, and how all of that is institutionally related. And because over the history of Filipinos migration in Hawaii, they have not been able to advance or hold equitable roles in different levels of Hawaiian society, in education, in their job, and thus the wealth they're bringing back home has stayed fairly low over time, right? So what, it's like a failure of affirmative action, a failure of equal opportunity law. So what legal obligation does the state have to rectify that huge injustice and inequity that's existed over decades now? And then what do you think we as just common people need to do to make sure that change is happening? Sorry, that's a big question.
Aina, do you want to answer, or do you want me to start? Okay.
I'm still gathering my thoughts.
Sure. Well, it's very complicated. I mean, I think one thing that we can look at right now is that the Department of Health, the auditor has pointed out that CDC guidance calls for local health authorities to ensure that people who need translation or interpretive services regarding contact tracing, or what to do to self-isolate, what happens if you've been exposed to COVID, that was not apparent from the auditor that that's occurring at the Department of Health. And the Mangraban v. UN case occurred in the 1970s, and several laws have been passed since then, including one that requires all state agencies to provide these services. And yet the auditor was not able to find any evidence that that's occurring. And that's something that actually affects everybody. It doesn't just affect Filipinos, or it doesn't affect people from various Pacific Island nations. It affects everybody, because community is spread affects everybody. So if you don't tell the person who's been exposed to COVID in a way that they understand, these are the things that we think will limit the spread of this disease, then it increases the chances that the disease will spread faster. And so I think that's one example of, well, we already have the laws on the books, we just need to have the agency that's supposed to be doing it to do it. And so I think a lot of the problems that I've seen working with family members and others in the Philippine immigrant community, really have to do with implementation of, or non-implementation of, the laws as they're actually already written. And you know, just as somebody might not prioritize going into higher education because of the present value versus the future value, the same is true about litigating. So not everybody's going to litigate these issues because what's the present value of it? And for some people, it's like, why bother? Let me just keep doing what I'm doing.
Thank you. Thank you. That was a really, really great response. Oh my gosh, I don't want to keep us too long, but there are so many good questions. Okay, are members of union leadership in the tourism service sector discussing the prospect of transitioning from tourism to other sectors? If so, how do you think Filipino leaders are contributing to shaping this conversation?
So that's actually a conversation that had come up within like the leadership, is if tourism doesn't work, right? Can we go into agriculture and stuff like that? And it's still an ongoing conversation, even with the larger community. I honestly, I don't know if anyone knows this, but Eric Gill, who is a Secretary Treasurer of Local 5, has been an activist since the 80s, and he doesn't like, we're not for tourism. Does that make sense? Like, we're not for building more hotels. We're not for corporations or anything like that. We are, it already exists, and we just want to make sure that workers have a union and the workers have a power and voice in their workplaces. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we 100% support tourism in Hawaii. So that's why there is a conversation that's going on already. I don't know if that's still happening. I mean, I don't know what the outcome of that conversation has been yet, but good question though. I will bring it up to our next meeting, to our next meeting.
Brianna, can I want to add something. Yeah. I saw this, I'm not sure, one of these boxes it posted, somebody who I guess doesn't want to provide their name has asked basically, well, don't all Filipinos just want to come here to make money and then go back to the Philippines? And actually, I'm glad that somebody asked that, because I think that my presentation as a whole, and also what Aina has shared, people really should consider that. I mean, I was trying to challenge the notion of the Filipino or the Philippines, because there are many different types of Filipinos, and there's also different types of Filipino immigrants. And so if someone came here as a child, if somebody was born here, if someone came here as an adult, all of those have factors, are all factors in whether someone is likely to, move home to the Philippines or go to the Philippines when they retire. Definitely older, middle-aged individuals who come to Hawaii and come with the idea that they're going to work and earn money are going to go back to the Philippines, like a lot of Sakatas did. But in my experience, if somebody comes here as a child, usually somewhere in the teens, is the general cutoff, that it's more likely if someone comes here as a young child, they aren't going back to the Philippines. This is their home and they're going to stay here, whereas that may not necessarily be true for somebody who's older. And so I think that's something to think about, is that, in the same way, if a judge sees a Filipino litigant who, seemingly can speak English but asks for a translator, I think some judges previously, in my experience, have questioned that, thinking, is this person trying to delay things, or is there a fraud issue or something like that? But the truth is that different people have different abilities, different skills, and different histories. And in the Philippines, there's 180 different languages, 11 major languages, and people come from all of those ethno-linguistic groups, and they all come from different backgrounds, and they came at different times, and some are born here, some parents are born here, or grandparents are born here. And so there was a time when there were a lot of Sakatas who did earn money and then go back to Ilocos, but that time has passed. And so I think it's important to realize that there's this great diversity of who are the Filipinos and what are their long-term aspirations, and what does that mean in terms of, all sorts of things about where they're going to live, settler colonialism, the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So it is just something to consider when people think about that there isn't a stereotypical Filipino that's everybody's just coming here to work and then they're going to go home. There is a segment of people that do that, but not all and not most.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that too. Again, what I had said, I'm 1.5 generation, so I came here at a really young age. I did not want to come to Hawaii. I just, you know, my dad was already here, so we got petitioned to come, and I was crying every single day when I first got here. I hated it. But now that I live here and I have a job and a career here, like my partner is here, I do want to build, like, I do want to build a life here. And yeah, my point is, like, not everyone, what Lance was saying too, is not everyone just comes here for work and then goes back. I know my parents want to do that, but I definitely don't see myself doing that too. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you, Anna. I have two questions that I want to get to, and then we're going to have to end our presentation today. So first question, what archive can someone consult to learn about instances of employment discrimination? For example, the Manuel Fernandez case. Are they online?
Okay, that's a good question. Sounds like a political scientist asking that question. So the short answer is the archive you go to is basically the newspaper. If you don't have an oral history of it, and in a lot of Philippine professional societies and in other Filipino groups, these cases, you know, are mentioned every so often. And if you sort of have to retain them or write them down when you hear them. But otherwise your only opportunity is the archive. I did not consult with Tony Ramil, for example, before I put up a slide about him. I hope he's okay. You know, his image doesn't change. He's like Dorian Gray. He basically looks the same from beginning to end. But I just took all of that from the newspapers, from what he said in the late 70s. And then he was interviewed like in the early 80s again about it. And so I took it from there, but that's basically, it's from the newspaper archives, because as far as I know, there hasn't been too much that has been written about the litigation cases. And there's a whole slew of discrimination in DOE against Philippine licensed teachers. It's still going on today. I've helped some family members who are like college professors who have advanced degrees in education, and basically they were told you have to go back to school and get another degree from UH if you want to teach at DOE. And that's ongoing, and that's been going on since '65. And it continues to go on. But I don't think that there, as far as I know, I can't think of anything that basically is consolidated all of those stories into one place. So basically the newspaper has been the primary source for a lot of these discrimination cases.
And you can access those on newspaper.com, correct?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Okay, last question. Do you have any advice for youth who are trying to reconstruct their Filipino identity, which may have been erased through colonialism and assimilation? And is there any research out there on this topic?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. I got most of the stuff. So when I was in high school, Amy Prusso is still here. She's listening somewhere, but there are some public high school teachers that really teach about decolonization, like in high school. And then it really helped also that I took ethnic studies at UH Manoa, because a lot of their work and the studies centered around like decolonization and embracing like Filipino identity. There are also a lot of Filipino youth group like Anak Bayan, which I've mentioned. We do, I think it's monthly like presentations about the Philippines and Filipino identity and stuff like that. So there are a lot of resources. If whoever that person is, if you want to reach out to me, I can put my email down below, and there's a lot of, again, resources that I have, and also like organizations you can participate in.
Yeah, and I think I would just add to that. Yeah, you can please also, as I indicated at the very beginning, please contact me. I'm happy to give resources, books, or anything, titles about anything I've talked about, papers and so forth. I definitely think that regardless of somebody's ethnicity, it's always a very good practice to learn the history of your family, your genealogy. Where does your family come from? And then the next thing you can do once you have a somewhat of a good idea about that is then you need to learn the history of the place that your ancestors came from. And of course, if you're in Hawaii, it wouldn't hurt to learn the Hawaiian language if you don't know it. That also is a good decolonizing practice if you're going to stay in Hawaii. Yeah, it's a relatively complex thing, and I think the more history that somebody comes to know about themselves and the place that their ancestors came from is a very strong tool in basically decolonizing the mind. Of course, learning Hawaiian and Hawaii would be one of those as well. But yeah, please email me. I'm happy. I can easily provide books and references to papers and journals and stuff for any of the topics that I've talked about.
Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Aina. Sorry, my screen just said I had an unstable connection, but I'll also, everyone who has attended today, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, everyone who's attended will get a follow-up email, and it includes the Judiciary History Center's email info@jhchawaii.net. So please email me any questions, and then I can forward you on to Lance and Aina to share all the material that you've seen today and other resources, ask more questions. Thank you so much for staying over time with us. This has been really a great conversation, so many good questions. I'm thankful I learned a lot today. So mahalo nui, Lance and Aina. Thank you everyone who attended today. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Stay safe, take care, and we'll see you next time. All right, aloha guys.
Aloha, thank you.
Bye.